Hi, so you're about to watch an interview I did with Nathan Cheng, who is a really interesting figure within the longevity movement. There's a lot of work trying to encourage private investment into longevity, but I do start with an apology, and that is for when I did this interview, my webcam was broken. So it's flickering like absolutely crazy. It looks like it's trying to send out weird Morse code signals, and eventually it just stops altogether. So I hope you can look past that because, as I say, he's got a lot of really interesting stuff to say, but I just wanted to be straight out with that apology. Welcome back. I'm delighted to be joined by Nathan Cheng, who is involved in the anti-aging movement. You're involved in a number of different capacities. So, Program Director of On Deck Longevity Biotech Fellowship, which you just told me about, and you just took that position a few weeks ago. You also publish a Longevity Marketcap Newsletter, which gives advice to people who want to invest in longevity. You describe yourself as on a mission to end aging on Twitter. So I say thank you very much for your time. I'm really, really grateful. The obvious place to start is, how did you first get interested in anti-aging and longevity?
Okay, yeah. Well, thank you for having me on your show, James. And yeah, so how did I get involved in longevity? So I guess if you go far back enough, my story sort of begins when I was in graduate school. So I was doing a PhD in physics at the University of Toronto in quantum optics. And I got 2 years into my PhD and had this sort of like existential crisis where I was just like, okay, what's the point of doing this? What's the point of doing anything? Life is too short, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And yeah, it got to the point where I just couldn't take anymore, and I ended up dropping out of my PhD, and I went backpacking around the world for like a year and a half. And ended up in China, worked there for a couple of years. I did some internet marketing. I did got into cryptocurrency, and then I came back to Toronto in Canada, and I was just like, hey, I've made this huge circle, but I don't, I've never really answered any of these questions that were bothering me. And I guess at that time, I was already aware of Aubrey de Grey and, Sens, and this idea that, potentially you could perhaps engineer your way out of, some of these degenerative processes and the aging sort of, the aging process itself. So, but my background is in physics, right? And I didn't even take biology in high school, so I figured, okay, well, this is something that the biologists and the biotechnologists will figure out one day. Like, it has nothing to do with me. But I saw this YouTube video of Laura Deming, and she was talking about how there was a lot of more money coming into this space, like more capital coming into the space of longevity biotechnology. But there wasn't enough founders, right? So she was putting out the call for founders, and I was like, aha, she must be talking to me. So naively, I said to myself, okay, I'll become a biotech founder. And so I started taking biology courses online, and just reading more about this space. And I guess last year I decided I just wanted to learn more about what different companies were doing in the anti-aging space, right? In the longevity biotechnology space. And the best way to learn is actually to write, right? So I went out and I would learn something and then write about it in a newsletter, which was the Longevity Marketcap Newsletter. And that started off very slowly, just for myself, my own selfish reasons, to just to force myself to learn. But then it started to grow, kind of rapidly and exponentially, up and to the right. And yeah, at some point, I realized, hey, you know what? Maybe the best thing for me to do right now is not to start my own biotech company, but to, I guess, convince 100 people to start longevity biotech companies. Yeah. So in this way, it's sort of like a leverage play, trying to just make things happen faster. And so that's sort of been my mission so far. And I've done a bunch of other things as well. So I have longevityList.com, which is basically a website where people can find like jobs, companies, and investors in the longevity biotechnology industry. Because when I was doing all this research about companies, I was just like, hey, there's a lot of jobs in on these different websites of these longevity biotech companies, and there must be other people like me who want to get involved in some sort of way. And why don't we just like collate all these jobs in one place so that people can find it, And the founders of these companies, of these startups, probably want to hire people who are extremely motivated to work on this problem as well. So it's a good match. But then, yeah, I also have a podcast called the Longevity Biotech, the Longevity Biotech Show, which is sort of like a once a week sort of thing that we record live on Clubhouse, and then we, publish it to, all the different podcast, channels, Spotify and Apple and that kind of stuff. And then, and then I guess with the On Deck Longevity Biotech Fellowship Program, the co-founder of On Deck, Eric Torenberg, he reached out to me earlier this year, and he was like, hey, this is a space that we're really interested in, and we can do some real good here in terms of accelerating progress in longevity. And for myself, I've been like sort of a solo entrepreneur for such a long time. It's weird working for a different company, but I just felt like we needed a program like this On Deck, Longevity Biotech Fellowship Program, because we just need more people coming into this space to work on, the problem of aging, to start companies in longevity biotech. Not many people know about this industry, and so with this program, we're just really excited to just get more people involved and create some awesome companies.
Yeah. I mean, you say, as you say, not many people know about it, but it does seem that public knowledge is kind of increasing quite dramatically. So, I mean, if you go back a decade, the idea of anti-aging was largely, but not exclusively, the work of quacks. I mean, there were some exceptions, of course, but now it's being taken very seriously. It's starting to be taken seriously as a scientific discipline, and it's starting to get quite a lot of venture funding. Obviously, it's a kind of high risk, high reward basis. I mean, do you think we reach a tipping point for longevity, for anti-aging, where arguments like aging is a disease and that we should treat it as such, and are actually starting to break through, but not just in the scientific community, but kind of into the general public as well? Yeah,
I think we're definitely at a tipping point. It's still early days, I would caution that, but things like David Sinclair's book, like I know many friends who have read that book who are not before were not interested in longevity, but they just happened to come across it, and there's just been a lot more discussion about this, and especially with COVID, I feel like that was also a tipping point, because at the end of the day, why is it that this virus disproportionately affects older people, right? If we could find a way to just rejuvenate people's immune systems, or potentially other parts of their body, then we wouldn't have such a big problem on our hands with this pandemic, right? So I think people are waking up to this idea that there's something about aging, and then like certain advances in the field that have sparked people's interest in potentially reversing aging as well, like epigenetic reprogramming. That's a very a hot field right now. But I think compared to probably 10 years ago, I'm sure it's come a long way, especially with like things like Calico getting into the space, and other people investing in longevity. But we still have a long ways to go as well, because if you ask anybody on the street right now, do you know that there are drugs being tested in clinical trials today that were developed in the context of aging? Most people would say no, right? Which is crazy, because this is like a huge idea, right? That people are actually testing these drugs today, right? So yeah, I think it's still promising, the future, but we've come a long way as well.
It's a bit of a tangent, but just because you mentioned earlier that you're interested in crypto, and there's been some quite interesting interactions between the crypto community and the longevity community in the past month or so. So obviously, Aubrey de Grey and Sens has received a large cash injection via crypto. I mean, is that a relationship you expected? Is this something you expect to see more of?
Yeah, I mean, I've asked myself this question many times, like why is there such a huge overlap between people who are into crypto and people who are into longevity? There's a couple of different ways you could explain it. I guess number one is like, people in crypto, they're sort of technical minded, they're thinking ahead, right? People who got in early were thinking really far ahead of what was possible. But yeah, it's just like these people who have a mindset of, okay, if you could fundamentally change something about technology, whether it's about money itself, right, or currency, or health, and like what is it about aging that for essentially time immemorial, we've just accepted that it's a process that happens to people. But what if you can just change that paradigm, right? And people who can identify these sort of areas of change that could, that are potentially on just the horizon. I think that sort of speaks to those two groups, the crypto people and the longevity people. Yeah, so that would be my number one guess as to why there's so much overlap between the two. And there's also some really great projects, that are leveraging like the sort of the benefits or the approaches of both, right? So you have VitaDAO. So I'm not sure if you heard of them, but
Yeah, I have.
okay, so VitaDAO is this decentralized autonomous organization, like a DAO, DAO.
Okay.
And basically their idea is they want to, fund longevity research and then tokenize or somehow tokenize the resulting IP on the Ethereum blockchain, right? So they've recently raised basically, I think it was 5.1 million US dollars in a token sale. And now they're, they have a great community of people who are, all really passionate about longevity, and, hopefully they'll be able to fund some great research. And it's all very experimental, like the structure that they're using to fund this. It's like decentralized. It's not a company. It's not a venture firm. It's like people all over the world in the cloud, voting on different proposals to where best put this capital. But it's super exciting times.
I mean, it's great to speak to someone who's involved with the longevity private sector, because I mean, kind of looking at it from an outside perspective, it seems every few weeks some new company I become aware of which is working on longevity. I mean, there seems to be so much energy in that sector. Is that what you're finding as well? I mean, I don't know if you were involved a couple of years ago, but is there a sort of a huge intensity of private capital? And presumably you'd expect that to continue and perhaps intensify.
Yeah, I mean, when I first started the newsletter, I was afraid, so this was like a year ago, I was afraid that there wouldn't be enough news to write something every week, right? But that hasn't actually been the case. So, there's always something going on in the longevity sector. And it's just exciting, whether it's, a new funding round or, a new company that's spun out from like a university, or, another person who's just come out, to announce that they're, working on this problem. So if you look at I have a graph somewhere in one of my newsletters where I sort of tracked the number of new companies formed every year in longevity, just using my database. And it's a clear up and to the right sort of phenomenon, especially after 2016, which was when the experiments at the Mayo Clinic sort of demonstrated that removal of senescent cells could extend median lifespan in mice, and affect some of these aging phenotypes as well. So that really galvanized the field, I feel like, in terms of private investment, because that was a pretty clear demonstration in mice that these targets that people had been talking about for so long, like senescent cells, that if you could target them and remove them, then you could have an effect on aging. Super.
I mean, one of the things I've spoken to lots of people involved in the movement. I mean, I had Aubrey de Grey on the channel, for example. And one of the things they all say, if they're involved on the scientific front line, is that it's getting better funding, but it's still quite tough. And it was really, really tough, which seemed very counterintuitive to me. I mean, it seemed that aging is obviously connected to so many different ill conditions, etc. It would seem to me that they should be flooded with money. I don't quite understand why that was the case. I mean, do you think they need kind of more public consciousness, awareness of even the argument that aging is a disease before people will be happy to governments will be happy to put money into this stuff? I mean, do you think that's the block? What do you think the stumbling line is? Sorry, that was a really confused question, but I was thinking aloud.
I think raising awareness about aging as the root cause of most of these age-related diseases is definitely going to help on the front of funding. That's for sure. It's an interesting situation because I don't know what it is, but when you say you want to work on, like, I don't know, something like Alzheimer's disease, which is essentially aging in the brain, right? By all definitions, right? 20-year-olds don't get Alzheimer's disease, right? People don't blink an eye, right? You can say, I want to cure Alzheimer's disease, and people will be like, yes, great, we'll support you. But the moment you say, oh, I want to cure aging, then everybody just starts coming up with sort of like bizarre arguments why you shouldn't do it, or it's unethical, or something about billionaires or dictators, like they'll just come up with some sort of reason why that's not a good idea, even though, in terms of like, if we're thinking like from a systematic perspective, aging is, the root cause of so many of the major, diseases that, kill people and, cause a lot of suffering as well. So it makes perfect sense to try and intervene in the aging process if it's possible, and there's a lot of scientific evidence to suggest that's, definitely possible, and especially in mice, right? So at this moment, it's just trying to get people more aware of, the potential, benefits of targeting aging that have nothing to do with, like immortality, or, becoming like a 20-year-old again or something like that. Like there's just so many things that, from an economic perspective, just a moral perspective in terms of like alleviating suffering, and just, a technological perspective in the sense that it will change so much of what we know about, health and medicine, right? Rejuvenation in some ways, I really believe, is the future of medicine. And we just need to get more people on board with this. It's, if you ask me how, it's just like, this is a tough question, right? Like, how do you get more people on board? It's really just, telling everybody, just getting more people involved, more people writing, whatever blogs, more people doing like YouTube
videos,
like yourself, or podcasts, right? Like if you look up longevity, like biotech podcasts, there's like 3 right now, but hopefully there will be like 100 in 10 years from now. Like that's.
I'm sure there will be.
Exactly. Yeah.
But that's because it is fascinating. If you speak to people on the street and you ask them about what they think of cancer, or, everyone will say cancer is terrible, it should be cured. And you ask them about any other, lung disease, whatever, that'll be the answer to pretty much every disease. But the idea of actually combating aging itself, I mean, not in everyone, but in some people has a sort of almost a psychological reaction. I mean, do you think obviously as a species, we've had to live with aging and with the inevitability of death since we've been self-aware. And we come up with a variety of different ways to cope with it. I mean, most of the kind of the major world religions, I suppose you could argue, are partly premised around answering that question. Do you think there's some psychological level which it's not yet ready to accept, or at least not the whole population, obviously, but a lot of people aren't ready to accept the idea that humans could have radically expanded lifespans?
Yeah, I think that's part of it, right? Because in the past, even let's say for the example of cancer, right? Certain like childhood cancers were essentially incurable for the longest time, and then all of a sudden there was a breakthrough, right? And then with like chemotherapy and Sydney Farber, right? And when that happened, right, like that just changed the entire paradigm for that specific cancer, right? And I feel like because we're so ingrained to accept aging, it is sort of like, I think other people have referred to it as almost like a Stockholm syndrome, right? We're just buddies with aging now, and we just like, people will try and accept it, or be like, oh, let's just shoot for healthy aging, right? Like whatever that's supposed to mean, even though I feel like that's an oxymoron, right? Like those two things are sort of like opposites, right? So I think I don't know what it is that we need. It's probably going to require realizing that that aging isn't this inevitable process. So I think that's sort of where we're heading towards. And the more companies that come on board and actually bring therapies to the clinic, increases the probability that eventually one will get through and make that like 0 to 1 transition. And at that point, then I think people will really sort of wake up to this idea.
Well, it's very interesting that you mentioned about obviously lots of drugs being in clinical trials, because I mean for the last few centuries, I can't remember the exact figure, but I think the kind of the average human lifespan expands by a couple of years every decade or something like that. But obviously that's all down to, none of that's down to sort of treatment towards aging. I mean, do you think there'll come a point where we're, once drugs start treating aging, this will start becoming a much more, kind of the public acceptance and kind of consciousness of what's going on will become much higher than it is at the moment? It's because we haven't had that moment yet where people take drugs and it slows down aging, and that's what we need to have before we get kind of general acceptance.
Yeah, I mean, like if we were talking about mice, right, then nobody would be, I don't think few people would object to the claim that we could modulate aging in mice, right?
Yeah.
Then people will say, oh, but humans are not mice, blah 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 blah, right? But I feel like we have these these drugs that are being developed, and if they can be translated in and demonstrated to be efficacious in clinical trials, then that will really change the conversation. But I think one of the other sort of issues that we haven't talked about is like, okay, but these trials are not really in aging itself, right? When you do a clinical trial for an anti-aging drug, you have to choose some sort of clinical indication, typically some sort of disease that's related to aging, or some sort of like rare disease that has maybe the same mechanism or related mechanism. So that's an interesting issue as well, just like figuring out a way to demonstrate that this really is, the drugs that are being developed really are, affecting aging systemically in the sense that, they could treat multiple age-related diseases at the same time. So, you have people like Nir Barzilai, right, who's spearheading the TAME trial, right? Yeah. And they're basically testing metformin to see if it can reduce all-cause mortality or reduce, onset of comorbidities of age-related diseases. So I think that would be like, a pivotal moment if that's successful. But then, if you have an anti-aging drug that, was developed in the context of aging, and you try it in one disease, in some age-related disease, and it works, and then you label expand to a different disease, and then that also works. And if you get like a third, then I think people will begin to wake up to this idea that, okay, yeah, this is for real, right? Yeah. And then, okay, the other approach that some companies are taking, right, to sort of get the first, I guess, success, but also like change the conversation about aging is longevity companies that are developing drugs for dogs, right? So this is
okay. Yeah, I saw that there's one in LA, which is quite high profile.
Oh yeah, I think there's one in San Francisco. Well, Loyal is.
It was somewhere in California, definitely. No, it's really. Yeah. Sorry, do carry on. It's really interesting.
Yeah. So Loyal is a startup that is developing, anti-aging therapies for dogs first. But there's several others. There's, Rejuvenate Bio, which is a George Church lab spinout that is developing a gene therapy to reverse aging in dogs. Yeah. And there's another one, GenFlow Biosciences as well, and Animal Biosciences. So there's quite a few different approaches being tried, and it makes a lot of sense because dogs, they share our environment. They, a lot of people treat them as family members, yeah. And on top of that, a lot of certain diseases that, age-related diseases that happen in humans don't really happen in mice, but they do happen in dogs. So, for example, like dementia, right? That's not really something that happens in mice, but dog dementia is a thing. So, it does. Dogs do represent sort of an interesting model to test anti-aging therapies in, because it's a little more similar to humans.
Obviously, I mean, there are some people involved in the longevity movement who talk about greatly expanded lifespans. So, humans living for thousands of years, or even immortality. Do you think that's unhelpful for the movement? Do you think that sort of is pushing well beyond where the science is at, and it kind of makes people think that it's a bit odd?
That this is a contentious issue. Yeah, I recognize that there's a lot of different views on this subject. Whether people should, you know, should talk about, immortality, because, maybe that's just, raises too many red flags and then it instantly turns off, people's interest in the field, or it makes it look like it's not legitimate. Um, I think the tent, or the field in longevity is big enough for everyone, and I think everyone wants to get on board, at least on doing something about age-related diseases, because that if we do nothing about it, it's essentially probably in the cards for most of us, right? And this idea of like immortality and like living to 1,000 years, that's something that I personally think would be cool. Like, why not? Like, if you could, I think people, if they were given the chance, to live longer lives, and they, voluntarily want to do it, then yeah, why not? Like, I think, there's a lot of cool things to learn and things to explore. A lot of people cite, like space travel as a reason why they want to live longer. But at the end of the day, I feel like we have like certain low-hanging fruit, or I don't know if you want to classify that, or term that as fruit, but like there are certain threats, maybe is a better way to term it, that are more near term, that we have to figure out first before you can even talk about living 1,000 years. So I think just doing something about age-related diseases first, that's like on the roadmap, and very time sensitive for everyone here. And just getting that out of the way, I think, is really important. But then, yeah, we can start thinking more radically in the future about like different ways we could extend human lifespan beyond the typical records of 120 or whatever. I think that's all fine. I mean, I don't see why you would necessarily want to stop extending human lifespan beyond a certain point, because in general, I think it's a moral imperative to give people the choice to live longer if they want to, and in good health, right? Yeah. Because at the end of the day, aging and age-related diseases causes just an immense amount of suffering.
I mean, do you think that future generations of humans, say, a few hundred years' time, will kind of look back on our era with our average life expectancies, if you're in a developed country in the kind of late 70s, early 80s, as kind of primitive, in the same way that we think about, say, human sacrifice or child labor? It's just something which is utterly archaic and just ridiculous. And why do people put up this for so long?
Yeah, I mean, there's an argument to be made for that. Like, if you oppose, longevity research or something like that, then are you impeding progress and, necessary and potentially, causing suffering by, preventing the development of therapies that could alleviate, age-related diseases and, their pathologies. So yeah, I mean, it's not a consensus view that we should be funding longevity research. I get this complaint all the time when I say, oh, we should invest more in aging science, aging biology, and a lot of people will say, oh, but we haven't solved cancer yet. We should focus on cancer first before we can think about aging, or or some other disease, right? And at the end of the day, yeah, you're asking in the future, if these therapies are developed and they become commonplace, then yeah, I think people will think that not having these therapies would have been sort of depriving people of a certain quality of life, and it would be immoral to do so. You can make the same parallel to like sanitation and I guess like antibiotics, right? Because the average human lifespan was something like 40 a while back, and it wasn't until we developed certain modern medicines and sanitation and preventative medicines in the sense of like preventing infectious disease, that we were able to get the average or median lifespan to somewhere in the 80s or 70s, something like that, right? Which is almost double, right? Yeah. And you would imagine if someone back then in before these were invented, if they had complained saying, oh, well, if we double, human lifespan, dictators will live, longer, and and there'll be overpopulation like that. If we look back, from now, if people had made those arguments back then, we would say, that's crazy, right? So yeah, I think that's something that could happen today.
I mean, just one final thought. So there's one very interesting analogy that I read recently. I can't actually remember for certain who it was for. I think it was from David Sinclair, but I'm not certain. But they compared the kind of the state of the longevity private sector at the moment to where internet companies were in the kind of late 80s, early 90s. So the argument being that there's very strong and growing interest within sectors which directly relate to it. It hasn't quite broken through to the public yet, but that potentially people can make a huge amount of money if they get it right, fundamentally. I mean, is that how you see the market going? Do you see it clearly is high risk, high reward? But I mean, do you think there will be longevity billionaires in the future?
Oh man, this is a very speculative question.
That's why I left it for last. I leave the cool ones for the end.
Yeah, I think who said that quote? I think it was probably Jim Mellon, who's a billionaire investor in the longevity biotechnology space. And yeah, he always compares it to sort of like we're in the dial-up phase of the internet, right? And we're just on this cusp of some rapid growth. And I sort of how should I put this? I don't like to make firm predictions on dates as to when things will happen, because predicting the future is always a tricky business. But what I do like to say is that I do think it's inevitable that we'll eventually develop these therapies sometime in the future. I don't know when, right? It could be 5 years from now, it could be 10 years, it could be 50 years, whatever. But the impetus to do it is there, right? There's so much economic argument to develop these therapies. There's a moral argument to do so. And as long as we can make consistent progress in the biological sciences and AI and all these other tools that will help us develop therapies in longevity, I think it will be inevitable that we will eventually have a success. And the matter is really just when will it happen? And when is, I don't know when, but the one thing I do know for sure is that it will happen faster if we have more people working on this problem. And so that's basically all I've been trying to do in my mission, just getting more people involved in working on aging. And yeah, hopefully we'll get there. But yeah, I don't want to make any firm predictions.
Well, on that extremely optimistic note, Nathan, it's been an absolute pleasure to have. Really, really interesting. Best of luck with all your work. I'll put a link in the description to where people can subscribe to your newsletter, which is I find very interesting, because I'm so interested in kind of the private sector stuff with longevity. But yeah, no, I say thank you very much for your time.
Yeah, thank you, James. It's been a pleasure.